Hi guys, it's Queen V here, or Vanessa. It's nice to see you again if you're coming back on my channel, or if you're new, welcome. I am a new YouTuber just starting ASMR. I am also a cam model full-time. Just want to keep that out there, not trying to hide my job or anything like some people think I might be. But yeah, I wanted to read another story tonight to you guys. I wanted to do a Stephen King, The Jaunt. I don't know if you've heard of it. It is a short story. It's short, but it's still somewhat long, so I was thinking we would do this in chapters. Each chapter will be about 15 to 20 minutes long. If it is a shorter one, I will read on to the next chapter and we'll just continue it. So yeah, please keep watching and enjoy. Thank you. The Jaunt by Stephen King. This is the last call for Jaunt 701. The pleasant female voice echoed through the blue concourse of New York's Port Authority terminal. The PAT had not changed much in the last 300 years or so. It's still grungy and a little frightening. The automated female voice was probably the most pleasant thing about it. This is Jaunt service to White City, Mars. The voice continued. All ticketed passengers should now be in the Blue Concourse Sleep Lounge. Make sure your validation papers are in order. Thank you. The upstairs lounge was not at all grungy. It had wall-to-wall, carpeted in oyster gray. The walls were an eggshell white and hung with pleasant, non-representational prints. A steady, soothing progression of colors met and swirled on the ceiling. There were 100 couches in the large room, neatly spaced in rows of 10. 5 Jaunt attendants circulate, speaking low, cherry voices and offering glasses of milk. At one side of the room was an entranceway, flanked by armed guards and another Jaunt attendant who was checking the validation papers of a latecomer, a harried-looking businessman with the New York Times folded under one arm. Directly opposite, the floor dropped away in a trough about 5 feet wide and perhaps 10 feet long. It passed through a doorless opening and looked a bit like a child's slide. The Oates family lay side by side on 4 Jaunt couches near the far end of the room. Mark Oates and his wife, Marilise, flanked the 2 children. "Dad, will you tell me about the Jaunt now?" Ricky asked. "You promised." "Yeah, Dad, you promised," Patricia added, and giggled shrilly for no good reason. A businessman with a build like a bull glanced over at them and went back in the fodder of papers he was examining as he lay on his back, his spit-shined shoes neatly together. From everywhere came the low murmur of conversation and the rustle of passengers settled down on the Jaunt couches. Mark glanced over at Marilise's Oates and winked. She winked back, but she was almost as nervous as Patty sounded. Why not, Mark thought. First Jaunt for all 3 of them. He and Marilise had discussed the advantages and drawbacks of moving the whole family for the last 6 months, since he'd gotten notification from Texaco Water that he was being transferred to Whitehead City. Finally, they had decided that all of them would go for the 2 years Mark would be stationed on Mars. He wondered now, looking at Marilise's pale face, if she was regretting the decision. He glanced at his watch and saw it was still almost half an hour to Jaunt time. That was enough time to tell the story, and he supposed it would take the kids' minds off their nervousness. Who knew, maybe it would even cool Marilee's out a little. All right, he said. Ricky and Pat were watching him seriously, his son 12, his daughter 9. He told himself again that Ricky would be deep in the swamp of puberty, and his daughter would likely be developing breasts by the time they got back to Earth, and found it difficult to believe. The kids would be going to the tiny Whitehead combined school with 100-odd engineering and oil company brats that were there. His son might well be going on a geology field trip to Phobos, not so many months distant. It's difficult to believe, but true. Who knows, he thought wryly. Maybe it'll be something about my Jaunt jumps too. So far as we know, he began, the Jaunt was invented about 312 years ago, around the year 1987, by a fellow named Victor Caroon. He did it as part of a private research project that was funded by some government money, and eventually the government took it over. And of course, in the end, it came down to either the government or the oil companies. The reason we don't know the exact date is because Caroon was something of an eccentric. You mean he was crazy, Dad? Ricky asked. Eccentric means a little bit crazy, dear, Marilee said, and smiled across the children at Mark. She looked a little less nervous now, he thought. Oh. So anyway, he'd been experimenting with the process for quite some time before he informed the government of what he had, Mark went on. And he only told them because he was running out of money and they weren't going to refund him. Your money cheerfully refunded, Pat said, and giggled shrilly again. That's right, honey, Mark said, and ruffled her hair gently. At the far end of the room, he saw a door slide noisily open, and 2 more attendants came out, dressed in bright red jumpers of the Jaunt service, pushing a rolling table. On it was a stainless steel nozzle attached to a rubber hose. Beneath the table skirts, tastefully hidden, Mark knew there were 2 bottles of gas. In the net bag hooked to the side were 100 disposable masks. Mark went on talking, not wanting his people to see the representative of Leith until they had to. And if he was given enough time to tell the whole story, they would welcome the gas passers with open arms, considering the alternative. Of course you know that the Jaunt is teleportation, no more or less, he said. Sometimes in college chemistry and physics they call it the Caroon process, but it's really teleportation. And it was Caroon himself, if you can believe the stories, who named it the Jaunt. He was a science fiction reader, and there's a story by a man named Alfred Bester. The Star's My Destination, it's called. And this fellow, Bester, made up the word Jaunt for teleportation in it. Except in his book, you could jaunt just by thinking about it, and we can't really do that. The attendants were fixing a mask to the steel nozzle and handing it to an elderly woman at the far end of the room. She took it, inhaled once, and felt quietly and limp on her couch. Her shirt had pulled up a little, revealing one slack thigh road mapped with varicose veins. An attendant considerately readjusted her, while the others pulled off the used mask and asphyxiated a fresh one. It was a process that made Mark think of the plastic glasses in motel rooms. He wished to God that Patty would cool off a little bit. He had seen children who had to be held down, and sometimes they screamed as the rubber mask covered their faces. It's not an abnormal reaction in a child, he supposed, but it's still nasty to watch, and he didn't want to see it happen to Patty. And Rick, he felt more confident. So I guess you could say the Jaunt came along at the last possible moment, he resumed. He spoke towards Ricky, but reached across and took his daughter's hand. Her palm was cool and sweating lightly. The world was running out of oil, and most of what was left belonged to in the Middle Eastern desert peoples who were committed to using it as a political weapon. They formed an oil cartel they called OPEC. "What's a cartel, Dad?" Patty asked. "Well, a monopoly," Mark said. "Like a club, honey," Marilee said. "And you could only be in that club if you had lots of oil." "Oh. I don't have time to sketch the whole mess in for you," Mark said. "You'll study some of it in school, but it was a mess. Let's let it go at that. If you owned a car, you could only drive it 2 days out of the week, and gas cost $15 a gallon." "Gosh," Ricky said, it only costs 4 cents or so a gallon now, doesn't it, Dad?" Mark smiled. "That's why we are going where we're going, Ricky. That's enough oil on Mars to last almost 8,000 years, and enough on Venus to last another 20,000. But oil isn't even important anymore. Now what we need most of all is water," Patty cried, and the businessman looked up from his paper and smiled at her for a moment. "That's right," Mark said. "Because of the years between 1960 and 2030, we poisoned most of ours. The first water lift from the Marshall ice caps was called Operation Straw. Yes, 2045 or thereabouts, but long before that, the Jaunt was being used to find sources of clean water here on Earth. And now, water is our major Martian export. The oil's strictly a sideline. But it was important then." The kids nodded. "The point is, those things were always there, but we were only able to get it because of the Jaunt. When Karun invented his process, the world was slipping into a dark age. The winter before, over 10,000 people had frozen to death in the U.S. alone. Because there wasn't enough energy to heat them." "Oh, yuck," Patty said, matter-of-factly. Mark glanced to his right and saw the attendants talking to a timid-looking man, persuading him. At last he took the mask, seemed to fall dead on his couch seconds later. First-timer, Mark thought. You can always tell. For Karun, it started with a pencil, some keys, a wristwatch, then some mice. The mice showed him there was a problem. Victor Karun came back to his laboratory in a stumbling fever of excitement. He thought he knew how Morse had felt, and Alexander Graham Bell, and Edison. But this was bigger than all of them. And twice he had almost wrecked the truck on its way back from the pet shop in New Paltz, where he had spent his last $20 on 9 white mice. What he had left in the world was 93 cents in his right front pocket and the $18 in his savings account. But this did not occur to him, and if it had, it certainly would not have bothered him. The lab was in a renovated barn at the end of a mile-long dirt road off Route 26. It's making the turn on this road where he had just missed cracking up his brat pickup for the second time. The gas tank was almost empty, and there would be no more for 10 days or to 2 weeks. But this did not concern him either. His mind was in a delirious whirl. What had happened was not totally unexpected. No. One of the reasons the government had funded him, even to the paltry tune of $20,000 a year, was because the unrealized possibility had always been there in the field of particle transmission. But to have it happen like this, suddenly, with no warning, and powered by less electricity than was needed to run a color TV. God, Christ. He brought the brat to the screech halt in the dirt in the dooryard, grabbing the box to the dirt seat beside him by the grab handles. On the box were dogs and cats and hamsters and goldfish, and the legend, "I came from Stackpole's house of pets," and ran from the big double-sided doors. From inside the box came the scurry and whisk of his test subjects. He tried to push one of the big doors open along its track, and when it wouldn't budge, he remembered that he had locked it. Karoon uttered a loud shit and fumbled for his keys. The government commanded that the lab be locked at all times. It's one of the strings they put on their money. But Karoon kept forgetting. He brought his keys out and for a moment simply stared at them, mesmerized, running the ball of his thumb over the notches in the brass ignition key. He thought again, God, Christ. Then he scrambled through the keys on the ring for the Yale key that unlocked the barn door. As the first telephone had been used inadvertently, Bell crying into it, Watson, come here, when he spilled some acid on his papers and himself. So the first act of teleportation had occurred by accident. Victor Karoon had teleported the first 2 fingers of his left hand across the 50-yard width of the barn. Karoon had set up 2 portals at opposite sides of the barn. On his end was a simple ion gun, available from an electronic supply warehouse for under $500. On the other end, standing just beyond the fair portal, both of them rectangular and the size of a paperback book, was a cloud chamber. Between them was what appeared to be an opaque shower curtain, except that shower curtains are not made of lead. The idea was to shoot the ions through Portal 1 and then walk around and watch them streaming across the cloud chamber, standing just beyond Portal 2, with the lead shields between to prove they really were being transmitted. Except that for the last 2 years, the process had only worked twice, and Karoon didn't have the slightest idea why. As he was setting the ion gun in place, his fingers had slipped through the portal. Ordinarily, no problem, but this morning his hip had also brushed the toggle switch on the control panel at the left of his portal. He was not aware of what had happened. The machine gave off only the lowest audible hum until he felt a tingling sensation in his fingers. Thank you so much for listening to Queen V ASMR. Please subscribe if you enjoyed. Like the video, that'd be awesome. Leave a comment of encouragement. Thank you for everyone who's been patient with me on my YouTube videos. I definitely want to create more content, and this is a story time little series that will be continuing. I'm pretty excited to start it. So yeah, have a good night, guys. Sweet dreams. Sleep soundly.